welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I'm talking about a book by one of my favorite fantasy authors, and that is Mark Lawrence. This is The Liar's Key. It is book 2 of the Red Queen's War trilogy. And I also wanted to say up front that I have read the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence, and now books 1 and 2 of the Red Queen's War trilogy. And there might be some spoilers for book 1, The Prince of Fools, and perhaps even some references to the Broken Empire trilogy in this video. So I just want to start out by acknowledging that I haven't been reading as much as I'd like to lately. I have actually been, for a good reason, I've been working very hard on my own writing for the last month or so, doing a lot of good revising. So that meant that I haven't been able, however, to read as much or even watch as many videos on BookTube these days. So I've been a little absent, so my apologies for that. But I hope it's been well worth it. So to begin this review, I actually want to do something a little different. I want to read something that Mark Lawrence wrote and posted on a Grimdark Facebook group. It's something that really hit me, and I thought, this is a good insight into, I guess, what Grimdark is, but fantasy in general, really, because sometimes I even wonder if the Grimdark label is helpful or not. I think overall probably it is, but it can lead to some misunderstanding. So I just want to read what Mark Lawrence had to say about Grimdark, because I think it's pretty darn insightful. Grimdark is often called hopeless, but in doing so people miss that it isn't apathetic. It is, for me, characterized by defiance in the absence of hope. Grimdark is often called nihilistic, but this misses the idea that you can accept a nihilistic truth and still choose to die for a principle you know is an emotional construct. A Grimdark hero has a tendency to go all in, to burn their bridges even when they don't need the warmth. They are, in their way, an allegory for hope, insomuch as, having been shown there's no meaning in the world, they still cling to some elements of it. And in those choices, they are revealed. The way it's painted by the disapproving, you would think that grimdark fiction was the literature of surrender to the inevitable, when it is, in truth, it is the story of the battle against it, sharpened by the knowledge that there's no ultimate victory to be had. I really admire that sentiment, and I actually relate it myself to the Vikings and their stories of Ragnarok. And there was nothing that the Vikings worshipped so much as courage in the face of certain doom. Everything is going to end in Ragnarok, but they still fight anyway. And perhaps the message here is that we create meaning in our struggle. And that is not so much nihilistic, I think, as existentialist. So someone probably should have told the Vikings that they were existentialists. And this, of course, has a lot to do with The Liar's Key. In The Liar's Key, we find out why this trilogy is called the Red Queen's War. And I love the little excerpt, or the little inscription or words here on the front. Pawns are meant to be sacrificed. And this certainly, the story does convey the sense of the characters feeling very small and very used often. But they still continue to struggle and to fight. And the meaning, once again, comes from the struggle. And it isn't all grim either. In fact, Mark Lawrence's sense of humor is among the very best. I'd put him way up there with like Joe Abercrombie. And no accident that they're both very well-known grimdark authors, I suppose. Although, in fact, I think Lawrence probably is the more purely grimdark author, in my opinion. But either way, the humor definitely serves to alleviate the gloom and doom of it all. And it's just absolutely wonderful, and it helps you to identify with these characters and their struggles. And it's so smart. I mean, Lawrence is one of the smartest writers I know. The insights into people are just tremendous in our contradictions and our conflicts. Speaking of bizarre and funny, Jalin Kendith continues to be an absolute delight. He is one of the best rogues I have ever come across in fantasy. He is a pile of contradictions. He is both a coward and a berserker. He is incredibly selfish, and at least he tries to tell himself that he's uncaring, but in fact he is sometimes touchingly empathetic. He is in fact self-delusional and very honest at the same time. I mean, he's just a bundle of contradictions. And we also get to learn a lot about him in The Liar's Key through these wonderful flashbacks. I'm going to talk about them in a minute when I talk about the narrative structure of this book, which I think is brilliant. But we learn a lot about Jalin and his past, the mystery of his ancestors, and of his childhood and the traumas that have formed him. And of course there is Snorri Snagason, whom is perhaps one of my favorite tragic figures in fantasy ever. He is a suffering figure. I mean, what he's going through. If you read the first book in this trilogy, The Prince of Fools, then you know that Snorri has gone through something that no one should ever go through, and that is the loss of his family, of his children, his wife, and in the most horrific and tragic way. And what the man has had to face. And he is just so admirable in his relentlessness. I mentioned the Vikings before. Snorri is a Viking. He embodies this idea of relentless courage in the face of certain doom. And even though there are moments when he admits to cowardice in here, I suppose there's a kind of courage in admitting to this kind of cowardice. It's a beautiful moment in here. There are actually some really touching moments in this story, and a lot of them happen between Snorri and Jalin, and whom Snorri persists in calling Jal, much to Jalin's annoyance, and probably Snorri realizes that. But it's the relationship between these two that is just so wonderful and touching. And there are additional characters that appear in The Liar's Key, which is actually I would say a broader book than Prince of Fools. This expands the narrative in some interesting ways, not least in the cast of characters. We have Kara, who is a northern witch. Really wonderfully realized character. I love her very dry sense of humor, and her relationship with Jalin is actually just gold. It's a lot of fun. And we get to see Jalin being perhaps a bit disappointed in his lustful aspirations toward Kara. And then, of course, there's Hennin, who is another new character in The Liar's Key. And this is a kid. And again, it's his relationship with Jalin that is really so interesting. And what Hennin brings out in Jalin is absolutely beautiful and touching. And The Liar's Key also fills out some of the villains for us, like Edris Dean. We learn a lot more about Edris Dean in the course of this narrative. And we had, I think, some very vague allusions to the Lady Blue in the first book. But here we get to learn a little bit more about her and what she's up to, what her motives are, what is at stake here in this war, the Red Queen's War, where there are these two tremendous rivals with great power who are manipulating all kinds of people beneath them. And of course you have the dead king, who is looming, constantly looming in the background of all of this. And we know, if you've read Broken Empire, you definitely know who the dead king is. So let's talk about the narrative here for a bit, because I think Mark Lawrence is one of the narrative geniuses of fantasy. And I'm saying this for a couple reasons here. One, you have in Jalin Kendeth a hysterical, wonderful, unreliable narrator. You got to count up the number of times that Jalin tells a bit of the story where he looks like a complete coward and by pure accident ends up looking like a hero. And I start to scratch my head and wonder, what's going on here? And we've seen his capacity to delude himself many times in the story. So I actually have to start thinking, is this guy actually braver than he keeps telling us? It's like that line in Hamlet, "Methinks she doth protest too much." In this case, I think Jalin might be protesting a bit much about his cowardice. And so that is one of the reasons why I think he's probably an unreliable narrative. So we ought to be a little careful when we're listening to what he's telling us. Another really clever thing in all of the books that I've read so far by Mark Lawrence is the excellent use of flashbacks. This is something you'll be familiar with if you've read The Broken Empire with Jorg's brilliant flashbacks, but here I might even like them even more because they're so cleverly worked into the narrative. They become an important part of the structure of the book. And these flashbacks happen through magic, which I also want to talk about a bit. But these are magically induced flashbacks that are actually very important for the progression of the story. And these flashbacks are the means by which we see into Jalen's past. Not only his personal past, but his ancestral past. And we begin to see a little bit more what the Red Queen is about. Not only her, but her two older twin or conjoined twin siblings, the Silent Sister and Garius, who play a very important role in backing up the Red Queen. And it's through these flashbacks that we learn about the Red Queen's childhood and her young adulthood and just what lengths this woman will go to win this war, this meta-narrative that is going on outside of the immediate story. Now, I mentioned the magic a little while ago, and I want to talk about it just a little bit because I love it. I love what Mark Lawrence is doing with magic here. It is definitely soft magic. It is not explained in detail how this works, and it manifests in various ways. You have various seers and witches and all kinds of different types of magic in here that appear, and it's very imaginative, and I really appreciate that he doesn't over-explain the magic. I like that. I like a sense of mystery and wonder in my magic. But he does, and this is a spoiler, so if you haven't read the Broken Empire trilogy, you might not want to hear what I'm about to say, but the magic is very much related to the setting and the past, the ancient past. So the Builders. The Builders are these ancient people who, from long ago, destroyed the world with probably something like nuclear holocaust or something like that. And they were, I think, at a stage of technology slightly more advanced than we are today. But at some point, anyway, they really messed up and things got out of hand and boom. And with this cataclysmic event, they created some kind of rift. And the ability for magic to appear in the world is a consequence of what the Builders did. So things are a bit off kilter, and they are sliding rapidly into a place of destruction and chaos. So that is something to know, and that's something that gets developed more and more here in the Red Queen's War trilogy, particularly here in The Liar's Key. I'm really looking forward to seeing where Lawrence takes this in the last book of the trilogy, The Wheel of Osheim. Speaking of Broken Empire, there are a few little tie-ins once again with that trilogy. Last book, we actually did encounter Jorg for a bit and some of his buddies. And in here, we meet up with Gorgoroth. So a little nice cameo in here that I enjoyed very much. And some really, I think the tie-ins are becoming actually more interesting with Broken Empire because of the development of that magical system. So I'd be very interested to see where Lawrence takes that in the third book. The last thing I want to remark on in terms of The Liar's Key is the pacing. Every book I've read by Mark Lawrence has just, flown by for me. Just boom, boom, boom. Wonderful action, relentless pace, and probably because I'm so invested in the characters, I just love all of his books, and the pacing is really good. But I will say that in The Liar's Key, the pacing is probably a bit slower, particularly in the beginning, and I think it's actually a longer book than most of his other books as well, and it doesn't look longer on the outside, but the print is really small, at least in my edition here. So I don't know for sure. I didn't look up the word count, but it is definitely a slightly slower paced book. But I didn't mind that at all because of what Lawrence is doing with the characters, with the development, with the evolution of the magical system and everything else. So definitely a wonderful addition to this trilogy. The middle book, always a tough one to pull off. Brilliantly done on Lawrence's part. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I cannot recommend this author enough to those of you who really love smart, funny writing in your fantasy. I'm really looking forward to book 3. And I am also looking forward to my next review, which is going to be on none other than Deadhouse Gates. I'm continuing with my reread of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I am so excited because I'm going to be talking with A.P. Canavan once again. We're going to be having both a non-spoiler talk and a spoiler talk. So, and a very big announcement as well when I do that review in about a week. You shall see it. I hope you will join me for that. Until next time.